Welcome to Full Throttle with Father and Son, the podcast where one F1 fanatic teams up with his wine-loving, tennis-playing dad to make sense of the fastest sport on earth.
We started this podcast every Sunday. I ask the questions all new fans ask, like, why build a track in a place where no one can pass? Who decided porpoising was a technical term?
That's right. That's why I've decided to make it my mission to try to convert my dad into a proper F1 fan, and let you guys in along the way on the genius and the madness of this sport.
As a dad, my world is more Grand Slams and Grand Crus than Grand Prix. F1 is new to me, but I'll bring curiosity and lots of interesting questions. Together, we break down the sport race by race and one hot take and a crash at a time.
So whether you're a hardcore F1 fan or a curious new viewer looking for a new experience and view on F1, this podcast is for you. There'll be no jargon, no gatekeeping, just good conversation.
This is Full Throttle with Father and Son.
Hello, welcome to this week's episode, Full Throttle with Father and Son. We're going to jump into the race highlights from this week. It's coming from Barcelona. So, Aishan, tell us more about this week's race.
Yeah, so this was a crazy race, really entertaining. This week we were at Barcelona in Spain, and it was another dominant race performance from McLaren, taking 1 and 2 with Piastri winning, extending his race lead, and Norris taking second. Leclerc from Ferrari was impressive in third, and Verstappen was the main loser of the race, ending up in 10th, and he had a really frustrating time. So there's a lot to unpack, and we'll get into it.
Oh, awesome. So it sounds like McLaren was dominant as usual. I'm just curious, why do you have two drivers from each team competing? What's the reason behind that?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the core things about F1 is it's both a team sport and an individual driver sport. So you can think of it as there are two tournaments happening at the exact same time at every race. One tournament is between all the drivers, in which case there's no team allegiances or anything. You're competing against your own teammate. It's just 20 drivers in a free-for-all. And then the second tournament is amongst the 10 teams, in which case the performances from each of the team's two drivers are added up. So the goal of the team is to win as many as possible for their individual drivers, but also to have each of their drivers do well in order for them to win the overall team championship. So those two things are called the drivers and the constructors championships.
Oh, that's awesome. That's excellent. So if I think back to my tennis days, this sounds a little bit like, tennis is usually seen as an individual sport where you have individuals winning and losing. But there's, all these different championships where it's more about the individual. But then you also have Davis Cup, which is played between countries where the individuals compete as well as the teams. So I can see this is sort of a similar to that, where you have an individual participating in a match, but at the same time they're representing their country, and I think they win and lose both as a team as an individual. So that's pretty cool. So in this case, McLaren sounds like McLaren drivers. What are they like? What are some things that are different between the two McLaren drivers? Is one better than the other? Just curious about how those two stack up.
Yeah, and I've actually never heard of the Davis Cup. That sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah,
Because
yeah. One day we'll talk about that. It's a pretty
yeah,
cool
I think
match.
yeah.
Well,
Mhm.
yeah.
McLaren is a very interesting driver pairing because they're both so good at what they do. They're so close. They've been first and second, basically switching off for the whole season so far. On the one hand, you have Lando Norris, who is sort of the elder statesman, even though he's probably like 3 years older than I am. I think he's like 25. He's been with McLaren since 2019, so for almost 6 years now. And and he is like one of the most locked drivers on the grid. I mean, McLaren assigned him to like multi-year contract, probably for the next 3 to 5 years. He is like their core mainstay driver. And so his advantage is experience. And then he's also had time to acclimate to the car, to acclimate to the way the McLaren team operates. And then they've also had time to adjust their car mechanics to work with him. Um, Piastri, on the other hand, is very young. He's probably like 21, I think. And this is only his second year in F1. And his advantage is just like sheer talent.
Mm.
He's basically a prodigy. I mean, he won F3, he won F2, and then he jumped straight into F1. Uh, or maybe, he jumped straight from F3. I got to check that. But yeah, he's a wildly talented driver. He's basically caught up and exceeded Norris in 2 years. And it's shaping up to be a really interesting battle because Norris is going to have to use his smarts and his like craft in order to try to beat Piastri, who's just got like the sheer talent and pace in the car. So it's a very interesting battle.
That's cool. And do the drivers tend to compete against each other more, or are they do they tend to put the competition against the other teams ahead of their individual competitions? What usually goes in their mind when they're in these races?
Yeah, so there are priorities. I think that the team always comes first,
Uh-huh.
or in most cases comes first. A healthy team culture is one where the team comes first. So if the drivers are fighting through the middle of the pack, the teams are going to want them to work together if possible, wherever possible. However, if you have a situation with McLaren where they're so dominant that they're going to come in first and second or somewhere in the top three, then
Hmm.
the drivers have some more leeway to kind of fight amongst themselves for their own positions because you know that they're both going to end up doing well for the team, and for the team, getting both drivers up there is what matters.
Got it.
So
Mhm.
yeah, that's kind of how it works.
Excellent. And is it normal for the teams to have like one rookie driver and one experienced driver, or does it just end up that way for McLaren this time?
Yeah, I mean, it usually ends up that way because usually a team doesn't sign two drivers at the same time. Um, yeah, so usually, the culture tends to work best when you've got one experienced guy and one new guy. So Ferrari, however, have a sort of interesting one that kind of refutes that because on the one hand, your experienced driver with the team is Charles Leclerc, who
Hmm.
has been with them since maybe like 2019, also, 6 years, 7 years,
Hmm.
and he's very experienced within the team. He's got the longest contract. He's also a total lock for Ferrari, like Norris is for McLaren. But then they've just signed Lewis Hamilton this year, who is, that he speaks his legend speaks for itself. He's won 100 races. He's been in the sport for almost 20 years,
Hmm.
and he's had a crazy run of it. So, however, he's the junior driver within the team, because he just joined. So that's a situation where it can lead to sort of an interesting conflict, but it doesn't always work out that way.
Okay, well, that's very interesting to hear. It sounds like they're going to have a fun season as well. I'm sure we'll talk about Ferrari and McLaren in some of the future episodes. So tell me what's going on with Verstappen and Red Bull. What happened there in this race, and any highlights from there?
Yeah, so this is turning into a real pain for Verstappen, I think. If you guys aren't caught up on previous seasons, he has been completely dominant. He's won 4 world championships by now, almost, consecutively, or yeah, completely consecutively. And what's happened essentially is that Verstappen's very particular driving style has become essentially what the car is only suited to. And so all these new drivers, for example, Yuki Tsunoda, who is a second driver and has just been upgraded to Red Bull, are really struggling to cope with his driving style. And Red Bull has gone through, three, maybe even four second drivers in the past few years trying to keep up with Verstappen, and they just can't find somebody who can match him.
Hmm.
So it's leading to a core problem because Verstappen is going to keep winning. Maybe not with McLaren anymore, but he's going to keep being all the way up there. But Red Bull's team championship standing is suffering because they can't supplement with the second set of points from the second driver also doing well.
Hmm.
So they really need to fix this problem.
Wow, this sounds interesting. This is where you have like there's such a big gap between the two teammates where the driver championship, if they still end up winning, but the team championship may suffer because they just don't have a good enough second team member that can fill in the shoes, I guess. Are the
Yeah,
cars
exactly.
built the same way for both the drivers, or are the cars kind of customized for the two drivers within the same team?
They can be slightly customized, but for the most extent, they have to stay the same.
I
And when you have a driver as good as Verstappen, the team is willing to make a lot of deeper level changes to suit his driving style. So to kind of give some more detail, um, Alex Albon, who currently races for Williams, used to be a Red Bull driver to Verstappen, and he was one of those guys that essentially, like, basically flamed out for not being good enough to keep up with Verstappen. And when people interviewed him later, he said that driving a car that was designed for Verstappen was like playing a racing game on 100% sensitivity.
uh,
So every little twitch of the steering wheel, every little, centimeter of the gas pedal, every little bit of the brake pedal is felt completely in the car. There's no play. And,
uh,
it's like you turn it a little bit and the car immediately goes off because that's what works for Verstappen. I mean, he's like a human computer.
wow.
So it works very well for him because he can drive very precisely and very quickly. But for anyone else, it's really difficult to adapt to because even a small change will basically just send you off the track.
Interesting.
And so you have to be really careful and cautious and therefore slower.
Interesting.
So it's turning into a big issue because that's really hard to shift between the two cars for the two teammates.
Wow. So is there any thing Red Bull should be doing differently in the future for this to be successful?
Yeah, I think honestly, Red Bull have put themselves in a really big pickle. And I think they're going to have to basically try to really find a design that works for both drivers, even if it's a little bit slower for Verstappen.
Uh-huh.
Because at this point, it's starting to cost them like the championship, the team championship. And I feel like they should lean on Verstappen a little bit more to sort of adapt because he's shown he's capable of that, definitely. They should lean on him to kind of adapt a little bit in order to make it more amenable for the second driver. I think it's a little bit of a reversal of priorities for a team to
Yeah.
try to do, but I think it's kind of the only way they're going to be able to save their championship.
Interesting.
So yeah,
It's like you got to slow down your best driver just a little bit so that you can get your other driver to perform just as well so you can win as an overall team.
yeah, exactly. And it's crucial because the team championship, there are monetary rewards for where you finish. You can win up to like hundreds of millions of dollars for
Wow.
finishing in first place, and the increments are in increments of 10 or 20 million going all the way down.
Wow.
Down to and even if you finish in sixth or seventh place, you're still winning like 15 to 20 million dollars.
Uh-huh.
So for a team that's running a financial operation, it's really important where you finish in the
Yeah.
championship
Yeah.
because it can make a difference. So this is actually a pretty crucial problem for them that they need to solve.
Wow. Cool. Hopefully they'll figure something out there. So I heard that the race may be moving away from Barcelona. So where do you think it's going to be, and what will be the impact of that to the race?
Yeah, so this is a big news item. From next year, it's going to be at a street circuit in Madrid. So they basically took an old industrial park and they found it, they're basically going to build a track layout with a bunch of streets and roundabouts and build a bunch of grandstands and then have the race there next year.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the advantage of that? And is this something that the F1 fans are going to welcome, or would this be seen as a negative?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't think it's going to go very well.
Uh-huh.
There's this trend right now where a lot of old, really important, really cool tracks are being replaced by these glitzy, glamorous street circuits because, it's in an industrial park, but it's obviously going to be dressed up. They're going to invite a bunch of celebrities. They're going to do a bunch of events there. I'm sure they'll get, fighter jet to fly over, helicopters, they'll do the works,
Right.
for this street circuit. But ultimately, the race itself is not going to be entertaining because streets are narrow. They don't make for good racing. They're usually straight. There's a lot of right angles. Racing around a roundabout is not very entertaining. You just kind of go single file. It's like a procession.
Hmm.
So it kind of is like what we were talking about last week with Monaco, where the racing is going to suffer, but it's going to get more social media attention, and there's going to be other things that they're focusing on as opposed to the actual quality of the race.
Interesting. So maybe the focus shifts back again to the qualifying race versus the actual race day in terms of seeing who gets the positions.
Yeah, I think that's going to end up being the case. We could be surprised. It would be a nice surprise if the race ends up being very entertaining, but I think unfortunately that's what it's going to end up being like.
Cool. That's interesting. Awesome. Well, I think, do you see this trend continuing? Are there other tracks that are in a similar danger of moving from, better locations to more street, city, style races?
Yeah, I think one that's really under concern is Spa-Francorchamps, which is in Belgium.
Uh-huh.
This is probably the most beloved race on the entire F1 calendar. It's a beautiful track. It's in the Belgian countryside, super like long, flowing, really fast corners. Makes for a lot of really good racing. And there's a lot of hills, and it's just a really dynamic, really interesting track.
Uh-huh.
And that's the kind of qualities that you want in an F1 track because it allows for a lot of interesting passes and overtaking and really high speed
Uh-huh.
uh, turns and all that. It just looks really cool. Unfortunately, that's being kept on a year-to-year contract, which means it's on the chopping block,
Wow.
and it's going to be replaced. Usually there are more and more tracks popping up in the Middle East that are going to be street circuits, and it's just a little disappointing because they're focusing on the wrong things. They're focusing on growing the revenue, growing that business empire that they've built around F1,
Hmm.
when what they're really leaving behind is some really cool races that, while yes, they're out in the countryside far away from everything, they produce really like awesome races and really fun races to watch.
Right, right, right. Well, that's I guess that we'll get to know that next year when they make a decision on that. I assume.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little doom and gloom, but we have a lot of time to go until lots of entertaining races until then.
Awesome.
And who knows? Maybe those new races will be interesting and exciting as well.
Cool. So what's on tap for next week? Where's the race happening next week?
Yeah, so I think we come to the end of the sort of triple header. So we had a 3 week stint of a race every week. So now we're going to take a break and we're going to come back in Canada. So we're going to have the Montreal Grand Prix. That's going
Nice,
to be interesting. That's a fun track.
nice.
And yeah, there'll be lots to talk about in 2 weeks.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we'll focus on some other topics for next week then to keep our conversations going. But this has been a lot of fun, and I think we'll say hi to the fans out there, and then we'll sign off and then regroup next week. So,
Yeah, definitely. Stay tuned for next week's episode and then further race recaps.
yeah, and this is Full
Full
Throttle.
throttle with father and son.
Have a good one, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.